Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, Minnesota, my hometown, out on the edge of the prairie. It was a beautiful, beautiful summer day, one of those perfect summer days that we think are rare, and actually they are not. And anyway, you know, how many do we deserve? I mean, how many do we expect as our due? How many are we entitled to? It's a gift, you know. Just say thank you, and maybe tomorrow will be as good. You never know. I was a reader back when I lived in Lake Wobegon, and so sunny days were not necessarily what I was looking for. Sunny days meant that you had to go out and pick potatoes, and that was the hardest work that there possibly was. You sat on the front porch, though, when it rained, and you felt so happy, and you sat there and the water was sluicing down out of the rain spouts and dripping off the eaves, and you sat there with your book, which was about a tramp steamer that was bound for Malay, and it was a crew of nefarious seamen, some of which seemed criminal and the rest seemed incompetent, and they were all there, and it was the first mate, John Phillips, who was responsible for bringing this load of tin roofing and hemp and truck transmissions all the way across the Pacific Ocean, because Captain McGuire was already on his third martini, and so there he was on the bridge. That was my idea of a good time, was reading a novel about other people I did not know, who were in desperate straits, and sunshine, I don't know. It just meant that you had to go work on a truck farm, and then in the evening you had to go out and play softball, and you were stuck out in right field, and you spent these long, tedious innings out there, you know, all by yourself. And then suddenly this moment of terror when this high fly ball is up, and it always were right in the sun, and you're looking directly into the sun, and people are yelling at you, back, 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 and the base runners are going, and you can't see it at all. No. When you've lived in one place for so long, you see, you go back and you are in a museum there. Everywhere you go, there are the dead. They're all around. The living are running around, you know, doing whatever the living need to do, and they're not aware of the dead, but I am. I walk there down Main Street, and there's the Mercantile and the owner Clifford, who used to fix up those window displays, and the women in the ancient sport clothes in the front windows, and Clifford bending over them and adjusting their garments, although you did sense that he was not that interested in women in his own life. But he had this amazing hairdo in which he made his few remaining strands of yellowish hair. He made them into a dome which defied the force of gravity. You could see through it. It was a work of art, and at certain hours of the day you could see the whole spectrum of light in this dome of hair. It's like he carried a rainbow under this dome. It was so disappointing when Clifford died to see him in his coffin. He looked deflated. He didn't look like that person at all. He'd been an angelic being, and now that he was dead, he was not. He was very, very mortal as a dead person. Back behind the Mercantile is the beach where my classmate Arlen, he went into the lake on his snow machine, which he had built himself. He was the first one to have one, and he was very proud of it. It was very loud. It was very fast, and there was ice on the lake, but it was December, and there wasn't enough ice on the lake. And all of us knew that if he hadn't seen Barb walking down by the lake, he never would have gone for it. But he was crazy about her, and she waved to him, and that wave was his death sentence. She waved to him, and he wanted to impress her, and so he gunned the engine, and it was a very powerful engine. And so, because he was so in love, he went very fast, and he got 150 yards out on the ice, out beyond where anybody could have saved him. And he sank out there. He died for love. He died for Barb. And then she married his brother Arnie instead, who turned out to be a very good husband after she got through the first 10 years or so, which had been odd because he was Arlen's twin after all, and it seemed to prolong the grieving process, to be sleeping next to the person you were grieving for. It was an odd thing, and coming from Lake Wobegon, of course, she couldn't talk to anybody about it. There were no grief counselors back in the day. But eventually Arnie did age, and his hair got very thin, and he got glasses, and he had back problems, so he became cautious, which Arlen had never been. And when this happened, and he came into his own, she gradually came to love him, which does happen. I look at the Chatterbox Cafe, and other people see a menu on a blackboard, and I see where people used to sit who are no longer living. Father Emil sat back in that corner booth, which of course we called the confessional then, and he was an old priest, and he had enormous black eyebrows. He was the man who saw so many weeping young women who had become pregnant, and at each one of them, he yelled the same thing. He yelled, "If you didn't want to go to Chicago, why'd you get on the train?" he said. This was his idea of counseling. He retired from Our Lady of Perpetual Responsibility, and he went to live in Gettysburg because he was a Civil War buff, and he walked that battlefield every day. The weather was even passable, and he died there. He died on the battlefield of a heart attack. He died behind Confederate lines where Longstreet's Corps had made its attack on the 2nd of July, 1863, and the Confederates were heroically repulsed by the 1st Minnesota Volunteers at great loss of life. And so it must have been very odd for Father Emil to realize where he was dying, surrounded by men in gray, he being a Union man, but death finds us where it will, of course. Jack of Jack's Auto Repair used to sit in the booth next to Father Emil, and of course they ignored each other. They acted as if the other one did not exist. Jack lived in his summer cabin out on the lake, out north of the lake. He sold his house in town after his wife Loretta died. It was just too sad for him to be there any longer. She sang on the radio, which was how they met. She sang on a late night show called Hobbs House, which was hosted by Franklin Hobbs from his cabin on Lake Hammond. And Jack fell in love with her sight unseen, just from hearing her sing "It Had to Be You" on the radio. And then he was called up by the Army, and he was terrified of losing her. And so he married her over the telephone, having never seen her. He married her from Fort Leonard Wood and came back 2 years later. And there she was. She was brunette, she was not blonde, and she was a little heavier than he thought she was, but she was Loretta. She was this beautiful, beautiful singer. So they kept the lights dim there in the house, and now the two of them are in the cemetery together. She was buried and he was cremated, and she was such a tidy person that you just know that it bothers her to have those ashes in the coffin with her. It's just trying to get rid of them. Jack never cared for my radio show, and he told me every time he saw me. He was a jazz guy. He did not care for sentimental songs about home, although I did point out to him that half of the sentimental songs were songs about wanting to leave home. But anyway, he's there. Jack is in the graveyard, and Larry, who manages the graveyard, tells me that he is saving me a spot, which is next to Jack and Loretta, which is a thought, you know, to lie for 100 years or so next to a guy who didn't like your work. Kind of makes cremation seem attractive somehow. I am at that age now where people start to use the word legacy, although there is no such thing, and we all know that. Just radio has the permanence of a sand castle, and even books that are printed on acid-free paper, they tend to migrate towards recycling rather quickly. I saw a book of mine on sale at a yard sale for 35 cents, and nobody was buying it, and that's the fate of a good many of us writers. I go down to the sub-basement of my neighborhood library, and I see there the books by the great literary lions of my day, Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor, all the heroes of my youth, now lying there unread. I once sat on the downtown Broadway local in Manhattan, and I rode sitting 4 feet away from a young African-American woman who was reading a book of mine. She was 4 feet away from me, and she was not laughing or even smiling, but she kept turning the pages. It was very hard for me to read the expression on her face. She looked like she was in the investment business, heading down to Wall Street. I couldn't tell. We just rode facing each other from 96th Street all the way down to 14th, and then I just couldn't take it any longer. If she had snapped the book shut and tossed it aside, it just would have killed me. She was posterity, and I couldn't bear to see how I would rank with her. But a few weeks ago, this boy named David came around after the show, and he liked a limerick that I had done on the show. He liked it well enough that he had memorized it, which is not that hard with a limerick. He knew this limerick. A young fellow from Pocatello said, "Why is my urine bright yellow? Was it something I ate, or could it be Kate who I dated on Saturday?" Hello! He liked this limerick. He liked another one of mine. A young fellow answered an ad and was hired and said, "I'm so glad to be given the chance. I could pee in my pants," and we looked and we saw that he had. He liked it a lot. He said, "Why do you like to write limericks?" Well, I like to write them because I discovered them when I was about his age, maybe a little younger, the age of 12, and I first came across the forbidden limerick. There was an old man of Nantucket, and I laughed so hard that stuff came out of my nose. This involuntary, convulsive laughter. And the same thing when I read about There Was an Old Man of Antietam. You can look it up on your own. Don't ask me to do the rest of them. I loved them so much. It was not what I set out to do. I intended to be a serious poet, to be a serious symbolist, suicidal poet, and to write dark, dark things. But instead, I was fascinated by the limerick. Hitler had just one ball. Goebbels had two, but they were small. Himmler had something similar, and Goering had no balls at all. I love this limerick. so I turned to it. I did not have the experience. I did not have the right childhood to write suicidal poetry. And so instead I did this show for which I wrote the occasional limerick. I used to do avant-garde dance with a blowtorch, blue paint, and no pants, which some people guessed was genius and the rest left quickly when given the chance. There is an old man of St. Paul put his desk in a toilet stall. It was quiet, conducive, and one had the use of the plumbing with no weight at all. A young Baptist lady of Aspen fell down groaning and gasping. She thought she'd been bit by a snake on her tit, but it was her Sunday school class spin. The thing about writing limericks is that if you write a great, great limerick, people will remember it, but they will forget the name of the person who wrote it. And that's okay. The permanence of anonymity, the immortality of the anonymous. Long live the jokes, and who cares who thought them up? They are permanent. And if years from now you should see the young fellow from Pocatello in a collection of verse or written on a toilet stall, it'll be anonymous, even though I wrote it in a hotel room once in Pocatello, Idaho, but that's okay. His urine will still be bright yellow, and he'll still be saying hello, and maybe some immature boy will laugh uncontrollably and stuff will come out his nose when he reads this limerick. And if that is the case, then we have come full circle, and what more can you hope for? That's the news from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average.